So for people who are of my age, you will have memory of A.J.P. Taylor, the historian, who, without a single note or an autocue, would simply address the camera and talk with extraordinary intelligence and fluency about, let's say, the origins of the Second World War. I am not A.J.P. Taylor. I am just going to read this. For those of you who might feel that you have other things to do instead of spending 14 minutes on this, could I just say it's a review of Henry Sommers Hall's Deleuze, Difference and Repetition. It's a book by one of the most intelligent, and I have to say one of the nicest young philosophers I have ever met. It is a book which I've now read for the purposes of this review several times and have been rewarded every time. I cannot recommend it too highly. So, as I say, that's the gist of this, but this is the review. Although Deleuze was a latecomer to the arrival of French theory in the Anglo-American world, he has since emerged as the most significant thinker of what Alain Badiou has termed philosophy's third golden age. It's now apparent that he was the most important thinker outside the natural sciences in the late 20th century. That said, the full measure of his political genius has yet to be taken. And crucially, the implications of his break with philosophies of identity and representation fully explored, which is why works like this wonderful book by Henry Sommers Hall are of such moment. If a doxa or church is not to form around Deleuzianism, and how he would have hated that, then we need to read Deleuze as he read Scotus, Spinoza, Leibniz, Hume, Nietzsche, Bergson, and, less obviously, but importantly, Sartre. But that will only be possible if our understanding of Deleuze is as profound as his of his precursors and intercessors. For that reason, we need guides as informed and insightful as that provided by Sommers Hall. For example, the temptation in reading Difference and Repetition is to search for and fasten upon a guiding thread. For example, to conceive the line of argument as basically a development of the reading of Nietzsche in Nietzsche and Philosophy with a Bergsonian twist. On this account, everything is produced by the differences between unequal, disparate, and heterogeneous forces, where, as Deleuze puts it, every phenomenon refers to an inequality by which it is conditioned, and where everything which happens and everything which appears is correlated with orders of difference. As difference makes for disequilibrium, it constitutes a problem inexorably pressing towards a resolution. Hence, everything which emerges is by way of being a solution to a problem. Each differentiation is a local integration or a local solution. However, every solution can only be provisional, for if difference as a process of differentiation has the first word, it also has the last. The Bergsonian twist is that while the problem is virtual, the solutions are actual, and the nature of the problem is not to be gleaned from its solution. The actual does not resemble the virtual. Qualities in extension do not mirror the quantitative differences which constitute the intensive. It's the great merit of Sommers Hall to have no truck with such casual, broad brush approaches. He would immediately insist that, as always with Deleuze, matters are far more complex. Deleuze, fully aware of the risk of lazy caricature, is at pains to create concepts which cannot be consigned to the prevailing forms of categorical thought. Hence, against the simplicities of the earlier account, Deleuze, as Sommers Hall explains, insists that differences do not produce individuals in any simple fashion. Rather, there is a fourfold process. The process by which intensity generates extensity is governed by a fourfold structure which Deleuze describes as differentiation with a T, individuation, dramatization, and then differentiation with a C. A process Summers Hall usefully explicates with the example of lightning. Here, a difference in electrical potential between the cloud and the ground, individuation, leads to a process of equalization of charge, differentiation, along a path of least resistance, dramatization, leading to the visible phenomenon, differentiation, that time with a C. As this rejoinder indicates, for Summers Hall, Deleuze is first and foremost a philosopher. His element is argument, not rhetoric. Summers Hall's achievement is to take the reader through Deleuze's rigorous and intricate arguments with extraordinary clarity and a formidable command of the philosophical background. One of the major problems for many readers of Deleuze and Reputation is the extent to which Deleuze assumes a daunting knowledge not only of the philosophical tradition, but of mathematics and the hard sciences. Few of us are at home in all of these areas, but fortunately for the uninitiated, Summers Hall is. Unerringly, he distills the relevant aspects of figures as diverse as Lucretius and Lenin, Rosenberg and Russell. Let's take his book, given that it is a reader's guide, as it takes Difference in Reputation, chapter by chapter. Let's start, therefore, with the introduction, in which Summers Hall identifies the project of the book as Deleuze's proposal of a concept of difference which goes beyond received wisdom. On the accepted view, we have two choices: either following Leibniz to take all difference to be conceptual, or following Kant, and in particular his argument apropos incongruent counterparts, to accept that there are non-conceptual differences resistant to further philosophical investigation. As Summers Hall incisively brings out, Deleuze, far from taking this as the final word, inquires into what these accounts presuppose but fail to consider, namely the intensive differences productive of the identifiable differences which populate the given. Right, that's the introduction, chapter 1. For the most part, the tradition is concentrated on the difference between given entities rather than the process of differentiation which gives rise to such entities. In quasi-Hegelian fashion, it is considered difference to be a matter of contrastive identifications. This is this because it is not that, and paid little attention to the process of genesis. It has failed to ask, how are the givens which we distinguish given in the first place? The first chapter of Difference in Repetition tells the story of this failure. It's an extremely complex story, turning in the opposition between Aristotle and Hegel on the one hand, and the proponents of equivocity, Duns Scotus, Spinoza, and Nietzsche on the other. The logic of the argumentation is as demanding as it is rigorous. Fortunately for the reader, Summers Hall is more than equal to the task of explication. Indeed, it's hard to see how his account could be better. Its explanations of the univocal nature of intensive difference and the relationship of sedentary and nomadic distributions to Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche's doctrine of the eternal return are as insightful as they are assured. Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is the most discussed and debated section of the book, not least because writers have seen the accounts of time, habit, and memory, drawn from Hume, Bergson, and Nietzsche, as harbingers of Deleuze's later work on, most notably, cinema. As always, Summers Hall's approach could not be more sure-footed, and courageously, he does not neglect the often ignored latter part of the chapter, where Deleuze dips his toe in psychoanalytic waters to emerge with an innovative reading of Freud's Beyond the Pleasure principle. He correctly identifies Deleuze's principal interlocutor as Kant. As just about everybody knows, Kant's thesis in the first critique is that the flux of the manifold is transformed into the coherent world of phenomenal reality by active syntheses. As these syntheses transform flux into the experience of determinate unified object, their operation presupposes a subject. For Kant, as Summers Hall succinctly puts it, the subject makes the object possible, and vice versa. While fully accepting the existence of the active syntheses, Deleuze argues that we need an account of the constitution of the subject through processes of passive synthesis. At this juncture, many commentators become fixated on the Bergsonian cast of the second synthesis. It is one of the merits of Summers Hall's reading that he identifies the key precursor, as in all of Deleuze's work prior to the period of co-authorship, as being Nietzsche. The chapter builds towards a reading of the eternal return as a sub-representational, intensive process productive of the novel, the new. Personally, at this point, I would have made more of the ungrounding of the subject and the concomitant possibility of surpassing existing modes of existence. But Summers Hall, like the majority of writers on the syntheses, concentrates on the autosynthetic nature of time and focuses discussion of the third synthesis on the famous empty form of time. I'm uncertain about this. Surely the second half of the chapter, that is the section on Freud, alerts us to the fact that the focus is elsewhere, namely on the human as at once constituted, constitutive, and surpassable. The empty form of time is empty precisely of self and subject. It's curious Summers Hall does not foreground this more, for he is fully alive to the roots of Deleuze's reading, the death drive, in Blanchot's conception of the two aspects of death, and Klosowski's gloss on Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. Perhaps here as elsewhere his brief required him to stay closer to the text than he does in a more discursive, and I would say even more interesting book on Hegel and Deleuze. Chapter 3. After pointing out the limitations of Kant's conception of thought as judgment in Chapter 2, Deleuze in the following chapter broadens his criticism to include a wider range of approaches. In many respects, this is the most approachable and straightforward section of Difference and Repetition. The notion that thinking can be inhibited and impaired by an image of thought, roughly taken for granted assumptions and presuppositions, has become common currency. But even here, Summers Hall has much to teach. His exposition of Deleuze's relationship with his interlocutors, Plato, Descartes, and Kant, demonstrates how easily those who only read the headlines in Deleuze's work collapse back into the very structures of representation and recognition which they imagine themselves to have exited. We're progressing. Chapter 4. Chapter 4 of Difference and Repetition, Deleuze elaborates the problem-question model in terms of the Kantian concept of ideas. For Kant, ideas are problematic in that they specify an object which, as it cannot be given, can be thought but never known. Hence an idea remains a problem to which there is no solution. Deleuze, in characteristic fashion, takes up and recasts this notion for his own purposes. In Deleuze's ontology, an idea becomes a way of thinking problems as undeterminable, but as giving rise to solution in the form of actualizations. The difficulty, as Summers Hall admirably brings out, is that the Kantian conception is only useful up to a point, for Kant explicates his concept through analogies with the empirical domain. Ideas as problems are understood in terms of the solutions issuing from them. As Deleuze insists throughout his work on the non-resemblance of the virtual and the actual, he eschews this analogical mode of thought and instead relates ideas to the empirical world while maintaining their differences in kind. If this is relatively undemanding, the subsequent turn in the argument, at least for those of us not of a mathematical bent, is anything but. To develop an account of the productivity of difference in the form of relationality, Deleuze draws on the calculus, and to further complicate matters, creatively takes up not only Leibniz, but later alternative theorizations. Obviously, readers not entirely comfortable with the various theories of the calculus will want a guide who is as clear as he is conversant with this challenging branch of mathematics. They need look no further than Summers Hall, in whose exposition even the most forbiddingly difficult features become both accessible and, in my case at least, intriguing. Chapter 5, we're almost finished. Chapter 5 considers intensive difference. As difference is that by which the given is given, it is ultimately uncancelable and consequently inimical to any conception of energy in terms of thermodynamics. Here, Summers Hall has recourse to the once influential work of Manuel de Landa, but in his invariably sure-footed way, avoids the pitfalls highlighted by Alberto Toscano. Instead of becoming mired in the findings of a particular scientific field, he focuses on the unequal in itself and the concomitant affirmation of difference. As this, at least to my mind, is the key, the driver of the entire enterprise, I would have placed this front and center. But as always, Summers Hall is dedicated to argument, not assertion. So instead of simplification, he explicates difference in itself and inequality as such in terms of the opposition between Aristotle and Bergson, and sets out the relevant aspects, biology, and, I thought very usefully, number theory, with an exemplary lucidity. Lest this appear too gushing, 2 comments. Perhaps a second edition might have a section on what Anne Sauvagnargues has termed the decisive contribution of Gilbert Simondon, as his notion of desperation is crucial for Deleuze's conception of problems as forged by intensive difference. Nietzsche's notion of the productivity of the relations between unequal forces is key to much of Deleuze's thinking and is powerfully recast by Simondon. Deleuze follows Simondon in holding individuation to be the solution to the solutions to the problems constituted by the existence of a disparateness. Secondly, we're almost finished. The conclusion gets short shrift. This is a pity for 2 reasons. First, because it sketches a very interesting notion of art, according to which art repeats rather than copying or imitating, and in repeating expresses difference with a force that is a freedom for the end of a world. Second, it's in the conclusion that the agenda is most eloquently presented. The affirmation, the capacity of difference to unground every identity, the modes of subjectivity concomitant with the world of representation. The groundlessness from which everything comes holds sway. New, more vital modes of existence are possible. 4. Beyond the I fractured by the abstract line, and the passive self produced by the groundlessness which it contemplates, there is a world of impersonal individuations and pre-individual singularities. The world of one, or they, where we encounter the final face of Dionysus. To conclude, towards the end of his life, Derrida remarked that he had not yet begun to read Plato. Similarly, all too many of those who have perused Deleuze have yet to read him. In that task, for them, as for all serious Deleuze scholars, Summers Hall's outstanding book will be of inestimable assistance and value. Thank you. So for people who are of my age, you will have memory of A.J.P. Taylor, the historian, who, without a single note or an autocue, would simply address the camera and talk with extraordinary intent, less obviously, but importantly, Sartre. But that will only be possible if our understanding of Deleuze is as profound as his of his precursors and intercessors. For that reason, we need guides as informed and insightful as that provided by Summers Hall. For example, the temptation in reading Difference and Reputation is to search for and fasten upon a guiding thread. For example, to conceive the line of argument as basically a development of the reading of Nietzsche in Nietzschean philosophy with a Bergsonian twist. It's a book which I've now read for the purposes of this review several times and have been rewarded every time. I cannot recommend it too highly. So, as I say, that's the gist of this, but this is the review. Although Deleuze was a latecomer to the arrival of French theory in the Anglo-American world, he has since emerged as the most significant thinker of what Alain Badiou has termed philosophy's third golden age. It's now apparent that he was the most important thinker, intelligence and fluency about, let's say, the origins of the Second World War. I am not A.J.P. Taylor. I am just going to read this. For those of you who might feel that you have other things to do in the next, instead of spending 14 minutes on this, could I just say it's a review of Henry Summers Hall's Deleuze, Difference and Repetition. It's a book by one of the most intelligent and I have to say one of the nicest young philosophers I have ever met. It has cited the natural sciences in the late 20th century. That said, the full measure of his political genius has yet to be taken. And crucially, the implications of his break with philosophies of identity and representation fully explored, which is why works like this wonderful book by Henry Summers Hall are of such moment. If a doxa or church is not to form around Deleuzianism, and how he would have hated that, then we need to read Deleuze as he read Scotus, Spinoza, Leibniz, Hume, Nietzsche, Bergson, and